Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Clerks Dose. So, going into this, I really would say that I feel like this sequel is kind of to the fact of just saying, like, well, hey, um, like, huzzah that we ended up doing the very first Clerks, and so let's do the sequel to just kind of have fun. I think really that's what this movie really is a movie to really have fun, but then also to really just have a movie that uh, kind of really does go, and instead of going into the actual gas station or the convenience store, which ultimately the first movie goes into, I think reasonably going into the fast food business to ultimately have it to where it seems like there could be some bajoking things that you could do with any number of this fast food stuff, I thought was kind of interesting. There was also some interesting dialogue that I think kind of appears within this movie at some points. We ultimately have Elias's character with Randall that has some interesting dialogue. We ultimately have it to where reasonably the story that is going on with Dante is really rather interesting. Also, there's some interesting things going on where you can really ultimately be like afraid where these characters are going to develop to. Is Dante going to be ripped away from his best friend? Is ultimately Dante's life going to end happily ever after, kind of thing at the end of this movie? Are we to also assess the one thing? We ultimately have it to where we have, uh, funny enough, we have it to where Kevin Smith's wife, Jennifer Smith, is ultimately in this movie, and she's playing Emma in this movie. And recently, when looking at it, I was like, wow, this is great to actually have, like, reasonably. I was so happy to have uh, Jennifer Smith in this movie and to have her have lines and all kinds of stuff. I was just kind of like, yeah, this is great. Told me see her in this movie. We ultimately have we ultimately have Ben Affleck, who just plays the gawking man. We ultimately have also seemingly most of all the real like guys that would otherwise be tied to a Kevin Smith movie for most of these, which I thought was really fun. I think we also had. I'm gonna mess this up. We also had Jason Lee as Lance Dowd, which ultimately I was like, yeah, that's great. Ultimately, like it seems like the My Name Is Earl kind of cast were kind of dipped into here a little bit, which I thought was interesting. But anyways, so we ultimately have it to where there's so many different paths that I can probably go through this with this review. I could ultimately talk about so many different things going on, and I think that that's the good thing. Like when looking at here, there's not an easy way to break this story all down. Um, a lot of people would say that there's not as much going on in this movie compared to the first one, but when looking at it, I just think that reasonably the thing about this movie is it's just like, well, why does there have to be so much going on? Like when really looking at it, like this movie is just a common story. Like it's I don't want to say it's a common movie, but like I want to say it's like a what is to go on in real life kind of thing. So ultimately you're not going to have it to where it's like from second to second everything is adrenaline rush and oh my god there's so much going on, it's craziness. It's not going to be like a Marvel movie, it's not going to be like a superhero film where like every second is just like god there's so much freaking going on, oh my god I'm overwhelmed kind of thing. And that's what I like about this movie is that ultimately it goes at a quite an even pace, and then it goes into a bizarre a little bit, and ultimately it needs to. But anyways, I would say that I enjoy this film. I wouldn't say that ultimately I would go out of my way to repetitiously keep watching it or go back to watching it. I mean, but I really enjoyed me watching it. It was just an enjoyable film. I guess that's all you could really say. So, anyways, let's go into that spoiler time. Let's go into that time of which that ultimately we would talk about this movie, because at the end of the day, there's a lot going on, much more so in the cryptic sense than there is. There's a lot going on with the spoilers. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time we get to spoil this movie. So we have it to where ultimately the convenience store, the gas station that ultimately Dante had and Randall had consistently been in, had burnt down. And ultimately, I would probably have a quick issue, really having to figure out what the actual name of that place was. I think it was like Quickie Mart or Quick Stop, Quick Shop, yeah. But ultimately end up finding out that ultimately it was a accidental problem, because ultimately Randall had asked if it was terrorist, which it wasn't. We ultimately have it to where Randall had mentioned about leaving the pot on or the oven on or something like that, and which ultimately caused the burning down of this place. So we end up having it to where the original Clerks was black and white, and this is of course being done in color. But they kind of remind us that ultimately it was done in black and white, which I can appreciate this movie for doing. So let's we go into this movie, and we have it to where now Dante and Randall are working at a fast food joint called Movies, which ultimately is otherwise tied to a bulk of Kevin Smith's movies. So I really like the fact that they kind of did that, because when looking at it, we had it to where a lot of the problems that a lot of people had in the first movie, um, like a lot of the issues were really tied to everything that was kind of convenience store or just a shop or whatever. Now having these guys in a different environment, there are different problems, and that's what I like about this movie, is putting them in a new environment, giving them new problems, or giving them uh, just interesting moments, like eventually when the store eventually gets busy and Becky loses her crap because it's like, hey, we're busy and where were you guys? So we end up having it to where also Jay and Silent Bob are supposedly new and improved. Ultimately, we have it to where Jay has seen the light, and we ultimately have it to where he is clean, and ultimately he is still a weed dealer at the back of some restaurant and or convenience store or whichever. And I thought that that was really interesting. We ultimately have it to where these guys are to ultimately deal to some kids ultimately, uh, or some guys, not kids, ultimately to have them talk about that they are now tying themselves onto the Holy Bible, and that ultimately, have you guys heard some verses of that book kind of thing? So we end up having it to where eventually we have it to our moving on. So Randall is, of course, as kind of off kilter as possible. We have it to where reasonably this character is really very offensive. That's what I mean by off kilter. Like compared to everybody else, there's sometimes where Randall doesn't realize that a lot of things are very offensive, and we have it to where we have a whole entire scene where ultimately we have it to where Randall is talking about a certain thing that ultimately he doesn't even realize is supposedly very offensive, and it's very a slang term and stuff like that. Ultimately, you can go and check out the movie on Tubi right now to check that out to the second of this recording. So, going in and watching this movie, I otherwise realized that like they're trying to tee up that Dante's to have a lot of things going on in this story. He always has to juggle women supposedly in these movies. So we ultimately have it to where it seems that Dante is going to be leaving movies soon to ultimately go and get married to Emma, which is again uh, Jennifer Smith, Emma. It seems that he's going to go off, and so he's ultimately going to leave this store soon. And so we end up having it to where ultimately Dante is also going to be mixed together with Becky, which will come in soon, which is Rosario Dawson, which ultimately I remember from all the Marvel Netflix shows. So we end up having it to where reasonably we have eventually people coming into the store. So we ultimately have Elias, who I thought was interesting because we have a character who is he's tying the Bible, or he's tying God with Transformers, which is bizarre. We end up having Elias being a big fan of Transformers, and so ultimately he's otherwise tying that ultimately God had created man and man had created Transformers, so ultimately Transformers is a gift from God. And Randall's like, dude, there is no way that Transformers is going to be a gift from God. A 90s cartoon? Are you kidding me? Kind of thing. Like, there's a lot of interesting dialogue that eventually goes with Elias, and ultimately there's some later dialogue that ultimately Elias talks about his girlfriend and how his girlfriend has bizarre things going on with her bate, which we'll get to later. So we end up having it to where there ends up being like people that end up kind of coming in and getting their meals and stuff like that. We end up having it to where Dante ends up opening the door of the bathroom to tell Randall to stop teasing Elias. And then we end up having Dante realize that there's people at this restaurant who are eating meals, and so ultimately he closes the door back up, going, "Oh crap! Like I didn't realize there was people in this store." So we end up having it to where Dante and or Randall and Elias are giving one another so much crap about Transformers and talking so much about movies and stuff like that. We eventually have it to where Randall was giving crap to some handicapped person before Elias had gotten there, and ultimately we have it to where this handicapped person was telling Randall to count his blessings that he's able to walk and whatever. And we have it to where Randall is giving this guy some shade about like, well, no, I'd rather just sit down and drive to everywhere I'm going, and so on and so forth. Like I would never want to really actually walk anywhere, and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where Elias is ultimately on the drive-through, and we eventually have it to where Randall in and Jay and Silent Bob are ending up giving Elias so much crap that ultimately he ends up trying to run away from it, and he doesn't realize that he ultimately has his headphones on, so he smacks and falls onto the ground because ultimately the wire only goes so far. So we end up having it to where eventually, so we find out that Dante's real true problem with quite possibly getting married is the whole like dancing part of the actual wedding, which I thought was bizarre. We end up having it to where Becky is getting her nails done or her toenails done by Dante. And so eventually we have it to where Dante confesses that ultimately he's having a problem uh, that he can't dance. So eventually we have it to where Becky goes out of her way to ultimately uh, go and help Dante to dance. So eventually we have it to where Dante and Becky end up dancing with one another. But then eventually we have it to where Dante just watches her dance. And so, like, you have it to where you can just see the face of Dante just, like, grinning from ear to ear kind of thing. And we have it to where he's just looking at her in utter amazement. And so we eventually have it to where we have the backstory of Becky and Dante mentioning that at some point that they had slept together. ultimately talking about that they had slept together in the restaurant, and ultimately we found out that ultimately Becky's character had some problem with mayo or something. So we go on, and so ultimately we have it to where Dante is going to get married to Emily, and ultimately at some point we have Emily show up at the movies to ultimately talk to Dante, and ultimately uh, have them both share a swing set together technically. And so we have it to where when Randall goes and talks to Emma, because there's a whole reason for all this of me getting to this whole moment. We end up having Randall talking to Emma and mention that she's basically one of the guys to him in his eyes. Um, and ultimately, like, we have it to where Randall can't even think of Emma naked or anything like that, or thinking of her as a normal woman. And we have it to where ultimately Emma ends up going and lifting her shirt up, and you can see her bra, but you can basically see everything. And then ultimately we have it to where Emma's like, well, I'm going to drop down my pants if ultimately you won't leave. And so eventually Randall does leave, and so and Emma and Dante have their moment. So we eventually have it to where Becky ends up seeing Emma and goes like, "Oh, hey, yeah, Mrs. Nick. Oh, isn't that great that you have that shirt on?" And eventually we have it to where Becky ends up mentioning to Dante later on, it's like, "Are you sure that you want to get married? Are you sure? Like, maybe there's somebody that has to convince you that you don't need to get married with Emma," kind of thing. And so that is to lead us to the moment where ultimately Dante and Becky end up deciding to. We have it where Dante and Becky dance with one another yet again. We end up having Dante eventually seemingly going into giving Becky like a kind of a dip dance maneuver, and we end up having it to where Dante spills that ultimately he thinks that he loves um, Becky, and then Becky reveals that she is pregnant with his child. So we end up having it to where Dante is supposed to not spill this secret to anybody, but eventually we have it to where Dante ends up spilling the secret to Randall, which ultimately has Jay and Silent Bob also in that same that area where Dante is going to spill to Randall. So we end up having to where basically Jay and Silent Bob know this information as well as Dante and Randall does. That's the stupid thing that they didn't realize. So we end up having it to where pushing on. So we end up having it to where Becky ends up going out, realizing that Dante had spilled the beans to Randall because Randall had spilled the beans to Becky about the baby, and so ultimately Becky runs off. We ultimately have to where Dante ends up running off after her, and we end up having it to where Randall's like, "Oh yeah, hey yeah, be gone for an hour trying to find her and talk to her," and because ultimately we have it to where Randall had done a special act uh, that ultimately is kind of bestiality, but it's whatever it is. So we end up having it to where it's supposedly a woman that is supposed to be doing this donkey act, but we'll find out later what actually happens. So we end up having it to where Dante ends up scrambling and going off. We also have it at some point in this movie. We also have some well-known people come in here and ultimately kind of just get a order of food and then go. We ultimately have it to where Ben Affleck comes in and ultimately is the gawking guy, evidently. And we ultimately have also where we also have it to where there is a guy called Kevin Wiseman that comes in and ultimately uh, talks to Elias about Lord of the Rings and basically how they have seen the Lord of the Rings movies several times. Ultimately, they have it to where they are kind of having a mixture of talking about Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and everything like that. Like, I thought it was hilarious how Randall was talking about the numerous times that they would just be walking through that movie, and I'm like, well, yeah, that's basically what they do through that entire bulk of the film. It's kind of like the Power Rangers movie, the very first original one, where all they're doing is really just walking everywhere. Like, and Lord of the Rings is just kind of the same thing, on how many hobbits have to walk through any number of places, and that's always kind of the boringest thing about those movies. Is just, God, there's just a lot of times of them just walking through certain sceneries and stuff like that. And Randall kind of nailed that to a T of that movie. So we end up having it to where at some point that Randall ends up humiliating this Lord of the Rings guy so much that he ends up barfing or whatever, and Randall has to call it out that ultimately he had humiliated this guy so much. So we ultimately have it to where also we have it to where Lance Dowes, who is Jason Lee, arrives and ultimately comes in to humiliate Randall and humiliate Dante for being at this fast food joint, to the point where Randall ultimately has to go run off and go and drive around with these seem like play these like go-kart esh like things. We ultimately have it to where ultimately Randall does that, so ultimately he doesn't have to, like, he can escape from all of this. He can just escape from his life by going on these little go-kart, little buggy, little things. Um, so ultimately we have it to where when Jason and or Jason Dante and Randall end up coming back to the restaurant, they're heavily busy. They have like so many orders that they have to fill, and so ultimately they crazily try to get that together. But anyways, mood point. There's so many tangents that I went on here. I'm kind of almost forgetting all the stuff that I've gotten through and mentioned and what have you. So we have, oh, here's where I was going with this. So we have it to ultimately Becky and Dante running up, driving around, and neither one of them had gotten to either one of them. And so ultimately they end up, Dante ends up going back to the restaurant, and so does Becky at some point. We end up having it to where we end up having it where Dante ultimately realizes that there is a fire going on in the restaurant, but really it's just smoke. It's smoke from a smoke machine, and ultimately we have it to where it's to prepare Dante for coming into this weird, bizarrish animal act of sorts. So we end up having it to where Randall had set this whole thing up to ultimately have some woman supposedly be pleased or please a animal of sorts. Ultimately, we have it where this is uh, this is Dante's going away present, bizarrely. So we end up having it to where all the guys get together. We have it to where Elias gets really drunk, and then bizarrely is having the weirdest boner or any number of things going on with him in this point in juncture. Here's the interesting dialogue that I have to go into, speaking of that. So, we have it to where Elias ultimately has a girlfriend, but bizarrely, it seems like this girlfriend has some kind of trolls within her body or some monsters within her body, which ultimately Elias cannot sleep with said girlfriend unless she is 21, because that's when the monster will pour out of her body. Hopefully, that's not a metaphor for a baby. That seems bizarre. We ultimately have it to where supposedly this Elias says that supposedly this girl also has a monster in her mouth, which will not allow her to kiss a guy either. And so Randall is hearing this story, and he is just godsmacked by all this. Just like, really, this guy really and truly believes all this? And like, is this girl really have any number of these problems? Um, like reasonably, like we have it to where Elias ultimately probably knew this whole fact from the movie Teeth. To where ultimately, you have it to where if you put your dong into a woman, ultimately your dong will be chopped off, kind of thing. So ultimately, probably getting the concept of all this from maybe the movie Teeth, unless that movie didn't come out yet, because I don't remember when it actually came out. I thought that was interesting. So back to the party. God, there's so many tangents that I have to kind of tailor around this story, but we're getting there. So we ultimately have it to where this dog and pony show, let's just say, not with any kind of dog, but with a pony. So we end up having it to find out that there is some burly man, there's some really hairy man that ultimately is to be dancing around this donkey. And ultimately, they're like, okay, when is the girl gonna come? When is the actual girl? Like, okay, who's Kelly? Kind of thing. So we end up having it to where Randall ends up scrambling up to the guy and otherwise is saying, like, okay, where's the girl? And the guy ultimately says, there is no girl. It's just me and the donkey. And so now we are to see a man off camera satisfy a donkey. And then eventually we have said man, mostly not actually seen, satisfying himself with a donkey. And ultimately we had it where Dante ended up calling 911 because ultimately he had thought that the place had burnt down. So we end up having Dante and ending up seeing this thing that he can't look away from. And I love Becky's reaction when ultimately she gets in the restaurant and she's seeing all this. We end up having Becky just losing her mind. It's just like, ah, like her eyes are so wide and her mouth is just like, ah, like she can't look away. And so we end up having it to where Becky ultimately like admits that she does love Dante and vice versa. And so we end up having it to where I have to pause here for a second. All right. So we end up having it to where ultimately the police is called, and so ultimately we have it to where police is called. Ultimately, a guy is going through this act. It ends up that seemingly people are going to get arrested, and Emma walks in to ultimately notice that Dante and Becky are kissing, and so ultimately she ends up throwing the cake seemingly in Dante's face, ultimately feeling betrayed, ultimately to the point of them calling off the marriage and everything. But reasonably, when really looking at it, Dante has a child with Becky, and ultimately it seems that they love one another. So ultimately, they are throwing Dante is throwing everything away with Emma to be with Becky. So we end up having it to where reasonably now. So Randall, Dante, Jay, and Silent Bob, everybody incorporated uh, with this act of sorts, was arrested, and so we end up having it to where reasonably uh, Randall and Dante in this prison are contemplating their lives about all the mistakes that they had made and everything like that. We end up having it to where reasonably Randall is desperately asking Dante to go and go back into wanting to put back together the convenience store that they had both worked in. To ultimately they to just kind of restart where everything had fallen apart. And so ultimately we have it to where Dante is like, well, like who's going to be able to give us money for this? We need like 50 grand to ultimately put this whole thing together. Ultimately, Jay and Silent Bob have that kind of money. So we ultimately have it toward the tail end of this movie that reasonably, like Dante and Becky are going to be together seemingly, but reasonably it has it to where Dante and Randall are working at the convenience store. And ultimately, Becky is just, I guess, on her own, I guess, working with Elias now. And so we end up having it to where reasonably at the very beginning of this movie, we ultimately have it to where reasonably Becky had mentioned that ultimately her being at this restaurant ultimately seemed to be a thing that was going to be a few weeks that turned into a few years. I'm kind of wondering about like her eventually having a child and everything like that, what that's going to do. So going into this, yeah, that's all that I wanted to go in and talk about this movie. Just kind of really rush through a lot of this review and get this out there. I thought that it was a really interesting movie, and also at the end of the day, it was kind of interesting to see where this all was going to head up, which is right back around where full circle, where the first Clerks movie ended. This is where this movie ended, where basically guys in a convenience store and ultimately just trying to sell some things. So that's all I wanted to say about this movie. And at the end of the day, that's all I wanted to say about this review. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.